Hi, Larry Taylor here with the Word in Focus. I was sharing in the last video about coming of age in the late 60s and early 70s, during which time the two big societal influences were the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And in the last video I talked about how the civil rights movement affected me personally and my little part in doing what I could to help out a tragic scenario. I want to talk now about my involvement in the anti-war movement. I run into people my age on a regular basis now. I run into people my age who are sporting hats, bumper stickers, t-shirts, about being proud to be Vietnam veterans. I don't in any way disparage or look down upon or minimize the tremendous sacrifice, the bravery, the courage that many of those people displayed. And I also recognize that almost all of them felt at the time and still feel now that they were doing the right thing. I don't blame them in any way for anything. In fact, I honor them and I admire them. Nevertheless, the historical reality is that the Vietnam War was not a war in which anyone was fighting for America or fighting for freedom. In fact, it was an illegal war. It was started illegally. It was never authorized there was never any declaration of war. The leaders openly lied to the American people. And the true motives behind it were economic and political. If you believe in just war theory, something that Augustine invented after what I consider to be the Faustian bargain between church and state, in the 4th century, the Roman emperors declared Christianity to be the state religion of Rome. Actually, prior to that, declared an end to the persecution of Christians, the toleration of Christians. And so it really started there when Christians suddenly found themselves in places of influence, places of wealth, places of power. When Christianity became the official state religion of Rome, a problem presented itself. It doesn't seem, from the standpoint of a typical Roman emperor, that one can run an empire and at the same time follow the teachings of Jesus. Jesus said to love your enemies. If you're going to run an empire, you have to kill your enemies. Jesus said to turn the other cheek. If you're going to run an empire, you have to seek revenge. Jesus said to give away all your money to the poor. If you're going to run an empire, you want to amass wealth. Jesus said the greatest in the kingdom is the servant of all, but if you're going to run an empire, then you have to have the most pompous of people and the most prideful, the most narcissistic of people running things. Constantine himself recognized that. He recognized that he could not truly follow Jesus and be the Roman emperor. So he continued to be the Roman emperor. He issued the Edict of Toleration, which ended the persecution against Christians. His mother professed to be a strong Christian. He supported Christians financially. He invited them into his administration. Christians suddenly were, rather than persecuted, now they were welcomed. Rather than poor, now they had the opportunity to be rich. Rather than disenfranchised, now they were empowered. But he himself never became a Christian, or at least never did until his deathbed. On his deathbed, when he knew he was dying, he called for a priest and received the sacrament and professed to give his life to the Lord. But he purposely did it just before he died, knowing that he could not run an empire and follow the teachings of Jesus. And that's always been the difficulty down throughout history. To follow the teachings of Jesus, you can't be starting wars, and you can't be greedy, and you can't be really lining up with just war theory. Augustine, in order to justify war, see, for the first 300 years of Christian history, almost no Christians ever joined the military. They were forbidden from joining the military by the church leaders. If they were already in the military, in some areas, the church leaders would insist that they get out of that to become Christians. In other instances, they said, well, you can continue on in your position as long as you promise before God never to kill another human being. So in other words, you can be a non-combatant in the military. For the first 300 years of Christianity, that was standard operating procedures. Christians refused, under any circumstances, to kill another human being, including self-defense. Then, Constantine, Christianity becomes the official religion of Rome. Church and state become married. Now the theologians have to justify the things that the empire is doing, including killing and war. So Augustine came up with his points about this is what makes a just war. If it has these characteristics, then it's a justifiable war. Well, personally, I reject that, just like my sisters and brothers in the first 3 centuries, would have rejected that. But even if you believe in a possibility of a just war, now, see, I think just war is just war. And when you go through the just war theory, it's like, how would you ever know that these are the motives and all? But anyway, even if you hold to that theory, even if you think some wars are justifiable, of course, everybody points to World War II and Hitler and such. My answer to that is that all the parties that were fighting in World War II claimed to be Christian. If they had been following Jesus, it never would have happened. But at any rate, even if you believe that there are such things as just wars, Vietnam was not one of them. Vietnam was an illegal war from every standpoint. We had no business being there. We were not fighting for freedom. We were not fighting to, for American principles or the flag or any of that stuff. So when I see these guys that are my age, or a little older, with the proud to be a Vietnam veteran hat or T-shirt or whatever, I'm glad they have a sense of accomplishment. I'm grateful that they were and hopefully still are men of integrity and honor and bravery and courage. I think they were deceived. I think that they were coerced through a number of circumstances into a war where they had no business being. I recognized that when I was a teenager. I began to study the history of how the French got involved in Vietnam, and after them the Americans, and how the war became escalated under President Kennedy and then radically escalated under Lyndon Johnson. I let myself be exposed to the horrors that were being inflicted on our own soldiers and sailors, and also on the people of Vietnam. And I recognized that this was something that I couldn't be a part of. So although I was too young to participate in most of the big civil rights marches or lunch counter sit-ins, I was not too young to participate in anti-war rallies. What disturbed me about those rallies, I thoroughly agreed, and still do, with the message of those rallies. And most of the people that were involved in those rallies were calling for nonviolent resistance. Martin Luther King Jr. Not only championed civil rights, but also championed nonviolent resistance to the war in Vietnam. And many, many others. I would say that the majority of the people that were leading the anti-war movement were committed to nonviolence, as were those who were leading the civil rights movement. But there was a small group of people who were not committed to nonviolence, who wanted to violently overthrow the American government, and who were engaged in plots to make bombs and kidnap people and that kind of stuff. They didn't amount to much. They didn't, in the grand scheme of things, they didn't really cause very much damage. They were, turns out, more talk than they were action, and they were a much smaller group of people than those who were committed to nonviolence. But nevertheless, those voices were there, and that bothered me. That seemed to me just as it seemed to me that was just as much denying the teachings of Jesus as was promoting war. Maybe the guns and bombs were smaller, but it was still violence. It was still not turning the other cheek. It was still not going the second mile. It still wasn't loving your enemies. and praying for those that persecute you. And so that part of it began to disturb me, and I pulled back a little bit from the marches, kind of stayed on the periphery a little bit and watched what was going on, in case that those violent voices became prominent. If they had, I don't think they did, but if they had, I didn't want to be associated with it. But I was very much opposed to the war in Vietnam. And very much felt that as a follower of Jesus, it was my responsibility to do what Jesus said to do. And that included having a servant's heart. It included the tutoring that I did in the inner city. It included resisting war. It included refusing to take up arms. And so I registered for the draft when I was 18 years old as a religious conscientious objector. That is, I registered as someone who is opposed to all war, any war, regardless of circumstances, and who refuses to participate in any war, based on my religious views, based on, for me, on the teachings of Jesus, particularly the Sermon on the Mount. And I gathered all the documentation that's necessary to do that, including a whole bunch of letters of support, not necessarily from people who agreed with me. Most of my letters of support were from people who disagreed with me, but who could honestly say, Larry is sincere about this. This is really what he believes. He's not just, making this up to get out of doing something he doesn't want to do. And so I registered as a conscientious objector. Then they instituted the lottery, and my number was fairly high, and so it wasn't likely that I was going to be called anyway. And then, not because of Vietnam, but just because I felt God's calling, I went into pastoral ministry, and ministers were exempt from military service. And so for me, it became a moot point. But I was ready and willing to do alternative service. Many of my friends and colleagues who were also conscientious objectors did alternative service. They would work in something, similar to the Peace Corps, or they'd work in a hospital, or that kind of thing, something where they were providing service to humanity, but not participating in war, particularly in the Vietnam War. I also knew, I didn't know them well, but I knew of people, guys my age, because back then it was all males that were being drafted. I knew I knew guys who burnt their draft cards in protest, fled to Canada. I would have been willing to do that also, had someone come along and said, no, you can't be a conscientious objector. We're giving you a gun and you're going to go kill people. I would have, under those circumstances, fled to Canada. And today, when I look at the COVID rates in the United States, and I look at the very low COVID rates in Canada, Here we've had all these spikes, and we've never really gone down. We've had spikes and then down slightly, then spikes and then down slightly, and more spikes. In Canada, it's been a low, steady line that's almost horizontal from the beginning of the pandemic and continuing on through the present. So, when I look at that, I kind of wish I had run away to Canada back in the day. Canada won't let me in now, won't let any of us in now who live in America because of the pandemic. So that was my involvement in the anti-war movement. In the last video, I talked about my periphery involvement in the civil rights movement. Here I was sharing some things about the anti-war movement. In the next video, I'd like to talk about this whole hippie thing, because you really can't talk about the late 60s and early 70s without talking about the hippies.